The school principal dismissed my son's bullying complaint. Then they saw my superintendent badge. Principal Eleanor Grayson told me my son was too sensitive, while Ethan sat next to me with a split lip and a bruise spreading across his left cheekbone like spilled ink. She said this from behind her mahogany desk in an office decorated with awards for excellence in student welfare and framed photos of herself shaking hands with politicians. Her voice carried that particular tone of condescension reserved for parents she'd already decided were overreacting, making problems where none existed. Ethan was 12 years old. He'd come home from school 3 hours earlier with blood on his shirt and wouldn't stop shaking. When I'd asked him what happened, he'd finally broken down and told me everything. 6 months of harassment. Daily humiliation, threats, physical violence that had escalated from shoving to punching. He'd reported it to teachers 5 times. Nothing changed. The bullies were the sons of prominent families, star athletes, kids who brought prestige to Lincoln Middle School. So Ethan learned to stay quiet, to accept that his suffering mattered less than maintaining the school's reputation. Until today, when Connor Yates had cornered him in the bathroom and beaten him while 2 other boys held the door shut. I'd taken photos of his injuries with my phone, timestamp and location data embedded, documented the blood on his shirt, asked him to write down everything he could remember while it was fresh. Then I'd called the school and requested an immediate meeting with Principal Grayson. I'd been superintendent of the Riverside School District for 3 years, but I'd kept that information private from the schools my son attended. Deliberately hadn't mentioned it during enrollment, hadn't pulled strings, hadn't used my position to give Ethan any advantages or special treatment. I wanted him to have a normal middle school experience, to be judged on his own merits without the complication of being the superintendent's kid. I'd moved to Riverside from another state to take this position, and we'd enrolled Ethan at Lincoln Middle School in a different attendance zone from the district office to maintain that separation. My wife, Jennifer, had questioned the decision, worried that hiding my role might backfire. She'd been right. Sitting in Principal Grayson's office, listening to her dismiss our son's trauma, I realized my attempt at giving Ethan normalcy had instead left him vulnerable to an institution that protected bullies over victims. Grayson had reviewed none of the documentation I'd brought, hadn't asked to see the photos or read Ethan's written account, just launched into a prepared speech about how middle school boys roughhoused sometimes, how social dynamics were complicated, how parents needed to let kids work things out themselves. She mentioned that Connor Yates was the quarterback of the football team, that his father was a major donor to the school, that Connor was going through a difficult time with his parents' divorce, as if any of that justified assault. "Mrs. Grayson," I said, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest, "my son was beaten in your bathroom by 3 students. He has physical injuries that required medical documentation. This isn't roughhousing, this is assault." Grayson's expression shifted to something between pity and annoyance. "Mr. Carver, I understand you're upset, but we've investigated these allegations before when Ethan has complained about social issues. Our teachers report that he can be somewhat withdrawn and sensitive. Sometimes children who struggle socially misinterpret normal interactions as bullying." The gaslighting was comprehensive and infuriating. She was suggesting my son had fabricated or exaggerated 6 months of abuse because he was sensitive. That the split lip and bruise I could literally see on his face were somehow a misunderstanding. "Are you saying my son inflicted these injuries on himself?" Grayson leaned back in her chair, her body language radiating authority and dismissal. "I'm saying that middle school is challenging for all students, and we can't be expected to monitor every interaction. If Ethan is struggling with the social environment here, perhaps you should consider whether this school is the right fit for him." She was suggesting we remove our son from the school rather than address the violence being perpetrated against him. The victim should leave, not the perpetrators. Classic institutional protection of those with power and influence. Ethan had been silent through most of this, but now he looked up at me with eyes that broke my heart. He'd learned that reporting abuse led to nothing but more abuse, and being told he was the problem. "Mr. Carver, I have another meeting in 5 minutes," Grayson said, glancing at her computer screen. "I appreciate you bringing your concerns to me, but I don't see any actionable violations of school policy here. Boys will be boys, as they say. If Ethan continues to have social difficulties, I can refer you to counseling resources." The dismissal was complete. She decided before we walked in that nothing would be done, and she was ending the meeting to avoid any further discussion. I pulled out my wallet and removed my district identification badge. The superintendent's seal was clearly visible, my title printed in bold letters beneath my photo. I set it on her desk where she couldn't avoid seeing it. Actually, Mrs. Grayson, I think we should continue this conversation. I'm Richard Carver, superintendent of Riverside School District. This is one of my schools. These are students under my jurisdiction. And you just told me that a documented assault against my son isn't an actionable violation of school policy. The color drained from Grayson's face. Her eyes went wide, darting from the badge to my face to Ethan and back to the badge. Her mouth opened and closed silently. The transformation was instant and devastating to watch. Dr. Carver, she stammered, using the title I'd deliberately omitted. I had no idea. Why didn't you identify yourself when you called? I picked up my badge and returned it to my wallet. Because I wanted to see how you handle a complaint from a regular parent. A parent without power or connections. And now I know exactly what that experience is. Grayson was scrambling, her professional composure crumbling. I apologize if I seemed dismissive. There are procedures we need to follow, documentation requirements. Let me pull Connor's file and review the incident reports from teachers. I'm sure we can resolve this situation appropriately. The sudden willingness to take action, to review files she'd just told me didn't show any problems, revealed everything. She wasn't responding to new information about the assault. Nothing about Ethan's injuries or the evidence I'd brought had changed. She was responding to my authority, to the threat I represented to her career. If I'd been anyone else, that meeting would have ended with my son being told to toughen up and my family being encouraged to leave. What incident reports from teachers? I asked. You just told me there were no actionable violations. Grayson's face flushed. I misspoke. There have been some reports of minor conflicts, but nothing that rose to the level of bullying according to our assessment protocols. I'd written those assessment protocols 2 years ago as part of a district-wide anti-bullying initiative, knew them intimately, knew they required immediate investigation of any physical altercation, mandatory parent notification, and potential suspension for assault. Mrs. Grayson, pull every incident report filed about my son for the past 6 months. Pull Connor Yates's disciplinary record. Pull the records for every student Ethan has named as participating in this harassment. I want them on my desk at the district office by 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. My voice had gone cold and administrative, the tone I used with principals who'd violated policy and tried to cover it up. Grayson nodded frantically, already typing notes. Of course. Absolutely. I'll have my assistant compile everything tonight. I stood, putting my hand on Ethan's shoulder. We're also filing a police report about today's assault. My son was physically attacked on school property, and the perpetrators need to face consequences beyond whatever disciplinary action you should have already taken. The mention of police made Grayson's hands freeze on her keyboard. Dr. Carver, involving law enforcement in what's essentially a school discipline matter might be an overreaction. We can handle this internally, ensure appropriate consequences, mandatory counseling for all parties involved. She wanted to keep this quiet, to handle it within the school's walls where she could control the narrative and protect the families who mattered. But I'd spent 3 years as superintendent, seeing how schools protected themselves at students' expense. How handling things internally usually meant protecting the institution's reputation over children's safety. No, I said firmly. This is assault. It will be reported to the police, and you'll cooperate fully with their investigation. The police station was a 15-minute drive from the school. Officer David Corman took our report, a veteran cop in his 50s who'd seen too many kids hurt by other kids. He photographed Ethan's injuries with a professional detachment that I appreciated, documenting evidence without making my son feel like an exhibit. Ethan gave his statement haltingly, describing the months of harassment culminating in today's bathroom attack. Corman asked detailed questions about previous incidents, about whether teachers had witnessed any of the bullying, about whether the school had taken any protective measures. The answer to that last question was no. Nothing had been done. This is going to be investigated as juvenile assault, Corman said, filling out forms with careful handwriting. Given the ages involved, the attackers won't be arrested, but they'll be referred to juvenile services. Court date will be set. The victim will need to testify if it goes to hearing. He looked at Ethan with kindness. I know that's scary, son, but what happened to you was a crime. These boys need to understand that. We left the station with a case number and Corman's business card. In the car, Ethan finally spoke. They're going to make it worse now. Connor and his friends. They'll say I'm a snitch. That I got them in trouble. The fear in his voice was heartbreaking. No one is going to hurt you again, I said. I promise you that. I didn't sleep that night. Lay awake thinking about every parent who'd sat in Principal Grayson's office and been dismissed the same way. Every kid who'd suffered because they didn't have a superintendent for a father. The injustice of it consumed me. By 6 a.m., I was at my office, pulling district policies on bullying, harassment, and mandatory reporting. Lincoln Middle School had violated multiple policies. Grayson had failed to investigate reported incidents, failed to notify parents about physical altercations, failed to implement safety plans for a victimized student. The pattern of failures was damning. At 8:45 a.m., my assistant knocked on my door. Principal Grayson is here with the records you requested. She's early. I told her to send Grayson in. She entered carrying a thick folder, her professional appearance perfectly maintained, but her eyes showing she hadn't slept either. Dr. Carver, I've compiled everything you asked for. There are 6 incident reports from teachers over the past semester, mentioning conflicts involving your son. Connor Yates has 2 prior disciplinary actions for aggressive behavior. The other students involved have clean records. She set the folder on my desk like she was presenting evidence at trial. I opened it and started reading. The first incident report was from September, 4 months ago. A teacher had observed Connor shoving Ethan into a locker and calling him names. The teacher's report recommended intervention and parent notification. There was no documentation of any follow-up action. The second report was from October. Different teacher, same pattern. Connor and 2 other boys had surrounded Ethan during lunch, knocked his tray to the floor, laughed while he cleaned it up. The teacher had reported it as bullying, requested administrative review. Again, no documentation of action taken. Report after report, the same story. Teachers seeing abuse, filing paperwork, then nothing happening. In one case, a teacher had specifically noted that she'd brought concerns about Ethan's safety to Principal Grayson's attention and been told the situation was being monitored. Mrs. Grayson, I said, looking up from the folder. You told me yesterday that there were no actionable violations of school policy. You told me my son was too sensitive and misinterpreting normal interactions. But these reports document repeated incidents of harassment and assault, reported by your own teachers, with no evidence of investigation or intervention. Grayson's hands clasped together in her lap, knuckles white. Dr. Carver, I can explain the decision-making process. I cut her off. The decision-making process that involved ignoring your own teacher's concerns? The process that left my son vulnerable to escalating violence? I want to understand what policy or procedure you followed that justified taking no action. She didn't have an answer. Or rather, she had an answer she couldn't say out loud, that Connor Yates's father donated $50,000 annually to the school's athletic program, that the Yates family had connections to the school board, that protecting certain students meant sacrificing others. I'm initiating a formal investigation into your handling of bullying reports at Lincoln Middle School, I said. It will be conducted by the district's compliance office. You'll be placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's completion. Assistant Principal Jerome Whitlock will assume leadership of the school effective immediately. Grayson's face went white. Dr. Carver, please. I've been principal at Lincoln for 8 years. My performance reviews have always been exemplary. This is one case where perhaps I made some errors in judgment, but it doesn't reflect my overall commitment to student safety. The plea was desperate and entirely self-interested. She was worried about her career, not about the students she'd failed to protect. This isn't one case, I said. This is a pattern of failures documented by your own staff. How many other students are being bullied while you look the other way to protect donors and athletes? I pulled out another document I'd prepared. This is your formal notice of administrative leave. You have 10 minutes to collect personal items from your office. You're not to contact students, parents, or staff members about the ongoing investigation. Violation of these terms will result in immediate termination. Grayson took the document with shaking hands. When she left my office, she looked like someone whose entire professional identity had collapsed. I felt no satisfaction, only anger that it had taken my son being beaten for this reckoning to happen. The story broke 3 days later. Someone leaked information about Grayson's administrative leave to the local news, and suddenly reporters were calling asking about the superintendent's son being bullied and the principal being removed from her position. I gave a carefully worded statement confirming that an investigation was underway regarding the handling of bullying complaints at Lincoln Middle School, that student safety was our top priority, and that we took all allegations of policy violations seriously. The coverage was immediate and intense. Parents from Lincoln started coming forward with their own stories of bullying complaints being dismissed, of their children being told to toughen up or stop being so sensitive. A mother named Angela Torres contacted me directly. Her daughter had been sexually harassed by a boy who'd grabbed her inappropriately multiple times. When Angela had reported it to Principal Grayson, she'd been told girls needed to understand that middle school boys were curious and didn't always know boundaries. The boy had never been disciplined. Angela had eventually pulled her daughter from the school. Another father, Marcus Wright. Wait, Marcus is forbidden. Another father, David Wright, shared that his son had been subjected to racist bullying for an entire year. The harassment included slurs, threats, and physical intimidation. David had documented everything, met with Grayson 4 times. She'd told him his son needed to develop thicker skin and learn to handle conflict without running to authority figures. The boy's grades had plummeted from the stress. He'd started having panic attacks. The pattern was clear and sickening. Grayson had systematically protected students from influential families while abandoning vulnerable kids. She'd created a culture where reporting abuse meant being blamed for being too sensitive. The compliance office investigation expanded beyond my son's case to examine every bullying complaint filed at Lincoln over the past 3 years. They interviewed dozens of students, parents, and staff members. The report, completed 4 weeks later, was damning. Of 83 documented bullying complaints, only 12 had resulted in any disciplinary action. The students who'd faced consequences were disproportionately those from lower-income families or minority backgrounds. The students who'd been protected from consequences were predominantly white, from wealthy families, or involved in athletics. One section of the report particularly haunted me. A 7th-grade student named Michael Russo had been bullied so severely that he'd attempted suicide. He'd survived, but his parents had withdrawn him from school and enrolled him in online classes. They'd filed a complaint with the district that had somehow never reached my desk. Grayson had settled it quietly, offering to cover the costs of Michael's online education in exchange for the parents signing a non-disclosure agreement. She'd paid them $15,000 from the school's discretionary fund and made the problem disappear. When I confronted her about this during her compliance hearing, she'd maintained that she'd been protecting the school's reputation and preventing a costly lawsuit. The school board met in emergency session to discuss the investigation findings. I'd worked with these 7 board members for 3 years, thought I understood their priorities and values. Now I was about to test whether those values included protecting children or protecting the district's image. Board President Catherine Sullivan opened the meeting. Dr. Carver, you've provided us with a comprehensive report detailing significant policy failures at Lincoln Middle School. The question before us is what action to take. I'd prepared a presentation with specific recommendations. Immediate termination of Principal Grayson's employment for cause. Mandatory retraining for all Lincoln staff on bullying prevention and mandatory reporting. Implementation of a district-wide reporting system that bypassed school administration and went directly to the compliance office. Criminal referral for the discretionary fund misuse. Public apology to the families who'd been failed. Board member Thomas Yates raised his hand, Connor's grandfather. He'd been on the board for 12 years, a major power broker in district politics. Dr. Carver, I appreciate your thoroughness, but I'm concerned we're overreacting to what amounts to administrative judgment calls. Principal Grayson has served this district with distinction for years. Are we really going to destroy her career over a few complaints from oversensitive parents? The comment was so perfectly on brand for the culture that had enabled this abuse that I almost laughed. Mr. Yates, Your grandson Connor is one of the primary perpetrators in multiple documented cases of assault and harassment. You're aware of that, correct? Yates's face reddened. My grandson is a good kid who made some mistakes. Boys get into scuffles. That's not bullying. That's normal adolescent behavior, and I resent the implication that my family connections have any bearing on this discussion. I pulled up a slide showing the demographic breakdown of disciplined versus protected students. The data shows that students from influential families, including yours, received preferential treatment when they were reported for bullying. Students without those connections were subjected to discipline for similar or less severe behaviors. That's not administrative judgment, Mr. Yates. That's institutional corruption. The room went silent. Another board member, Janet Liu, spoke up. She was a former teacher, someone I'd always respected. Dr. Carver, these are serious allegations you're making against Principal Grayson and, implicitly, against this board for not catching these patterns sooner. What evidence do we have beyond anecdotal complaints? I'd anticipated this, pulled up emails between Grayson and certain board members, including Thomas Yates, where they'd discussed specific bullying cases. In one email chain, Yates had explicitly told Grayson not to discipline his grandson, that Connor was going through a tough time and needed understanding, not punishment. Grayson had complied, dismissing a formal complaint from my son without investigation. This email is dated November 15th, I said, 3 days after Ethan reported being pushed downstairs by Connor and 2 other students. Principal Grayson received a direct instruction from board member Yates to not discipline his grandson. She followed that instruction, violating district policy and her duty to all students. The revelation shifted the room's energy. Board members who'd been prepared to defend Grayson were now seeing the extent of the corruption. Yates tried to salvage the situation. That email has been taken out of context. I was simply advocating for my grandson as any family member would. I didn't tell Principal Grayson to violate policy. I pulled up the next slide. Here's an email from you to Principal Grayson dated January 8th of this year. Quote, Eleanor, I'm aware there's another complaint about Connor from the Carver boy. I'd appreciate it if you'd handle this discreetly. Connor's father is going through a difficult divorce and the kid doesn't need additional stress from school discipline. I'm sure we can resolve this without formal action. I let that sit for a moment. You instructed the principal to handle a documented assault discreetly to protect your grandson from consequences. That's not advocacy, Mr. Yates. That's abuse of your position on this board. Yates stood abruptly. I don't have to sit here and be accused of corruption by someone who's clearly on a personal vendetta because his son couldn't handle normal middle school social dynamics. The deflection was predictable but still infuriating. My son was beaten unconscious in a school bathroom, Mr. Yates. He has a concussion, a fractured rib, and psychological trauma that will take years to heal. That's not normal social dynamics. That's assault, and your grandson participated in it. Catherine Sullivan intervened. Gentlemen, let's maintain professional decorum. Dr. Carver, do you have additional evidence of board member interference in administrative decisions? I had 3 more email chains showing similar patterns with different board members protecting different students. The culture of protecting the powerful was institutional, not isolated to Yates. Sullivan reviewed the evidence, her expression growing grimmer. This is deeply troubling. The board has clearly overstepped our role and influenced administrative decisions in ways that compromised student safety. Yates wasn't backing down. I move that we end this meeting and table this discussion until we can have legal counsel review these allegations. Dr. Carver has a clear conflict of interest here, and his judgment is compromised by his personal involvement. Janet Liu shook her head. I disagree. Dr. Carver's personal involvement makes him uniquely aware of the institutional failures. If anything, his willingness to expose these problems despite the personal cost shows integrity, not bias. The debate continued for 2 hours. Finally, Sullivan called for a vote on my recommendations. The motion to terminate Grayson's employment passed 5-2, with Yates and 1 other member dissenting. The motion to implement new oversight procedures passed unanimously. The motion to publicly acknowledge the district's failures passed 4-3. But the most contentious vote was whether to request Thomas Yates's resignation from the board for ethics violations. That failed, 3-4. Yates would remain on the board, his corruption documented but not punished. Political reality meant that some accountability was impossible, at least through official channels. I left that meeting exhausted and angry, knowing I'd won battles but not the war. Connor Yates and his accomplices were eventually charged in juvenile court with assault. The hearing was closed to protect the minors' identities, but I attended as Ethan's father. Connor's attorney argued that this was a mutual fight that had gotten out of hand, that all boys involved were equally responsible. He painted Connor as a troubled kid dealing with his parents' divorce, someone who needed counseling and support, not criminal penalties. The prosecutor, Lisa Vance, presented the 6 months of documented harassment, the escalating pattern of violence, the fact that Ethan had been cornered by 3 attackers. She presented testimony from teachers who'd witnessed the bullying. Medical records showing Ethan's injuries, his written statement describing the attack. The judge, Magistrate Helen Torres, reviewed everything with care. When she delivered her ruling, her voice was firm. The evidence shows a clear pattern of targeted harassment culminating in a group assault. This was not mutual combat. This was victimization of a vulnerable student by multiple aggressors. Connor and the other boys were found responsible for assault. Their sentences included mandatory counseling, community service, written apologies to Ethan, and probation. If they violated probation terms or engaged in any further violence, they'd face detention. It was light punishment for what they'd done, but it was something. Principal Grayson's termination was finalized in August. She'd hired an attorney who'd threatened to sue for wrongful termination, claiming she'd been scapegoated for systemic failures. The district's legal team was prepared to defend the termination in court, presenting the overwhelming evidence of policy violations, but Grayson ultimately settled. She'd accept termination without a wrongful discharge lawsuit in exchange for a confidential severance package and a neutral reference. I hated the settlement, hated that she'd escape with her reputation partially intact, but the district's lawyers advised that going to trial would cost more and risk unpredictable outcomes. We took the settlement. Ethan started therapy in June with Dr. Nina Brennan, a psychologist who specialized in childhood trauma and bullying victims. The sessions were difficult. He'd spent 6 months learning that reporting abuse made things worse, that authority figures would protect his attackers. Rebuilding his trust in institutions, in adults, in his own safety took months. Jennifer and I attended family counseling sessions where Dr. Brennan helped us understand the long-term impacts of what Ethan had experienced. The depression, the anxiety, the hypervigilance. She warned us that healing wasn't linear, that there would be setbacks. She was right. Ethan had nightmares. Panic attacks when we drove past the school. Refused to eat lunch at restaurants because school cafeterias triggered memories. We transferred him to a different middle school for the fall semester, one in a neighboring district where he could start fresh. The first day of school, he came home and told us about a kid who'd shoved another student in the hallway. I told the teacher, Ethan said, and she actually did something about it. She pulled both kids aside and talked to them. The kid who shoved apologized. The relief in his voice was heartbreaking. That's all he'd wanted at Lincoln. Adults who took action when students were hurt. Meanwhile, I'd initiated a district-wide review of every school's bullying response procedures, assembled a task force of teachers, counselors, parents, and students to redesign our policies. We'd implemented mandatory training for all staff on recognizing and responding to harassment, created an anonymous reporting system that went directly to the compliance office, established clear consequences for administrators who failed to investigate reports. The changes were comprehensive and specific, built on the lessons learned from Lincoln's failures. But I also knew that policy changes meant nothing without cultural change. We held community meetings at every school, presenting the data on bullying's impacts and our new procedures. Some parents praised the transparency. Others complained that we were being too strict, that we'd create a zero-tolerance environment that punished normal childhood conflicts. One father stood up at a meeting and said his son had been suspended for just teasing another student. I pulled up the incident report on my laptop, reading the details. Your son cornered a classmate in the bathroom and threatened to beat him up if he didn't hand over his lunch money. That's not teasing. That's extortion and intimidation. The father sputtered that I was taking things too seriously, that kids needed to learn to handle conflict. I was tired of that argument. Your son is learning that threatening violence has consequences. The other child is learning that adults will protect him. Those are both lessons they need. The resistance reminded me that changing systems was harder than exposing their failures. Every step forward faced pushback from parents who benefited from the old culture of selective enforcement. Thomas Yates remained on the school board, a constant source of obstruction. He voted against every policy reform I proposed, argued that we were overreacting to isolated incidents, suggested I was on a personal crusade that was harming the district's reputation. At one board meeting, he openly questioned whether I was fit to serve as superintendent given my emotional involvement in these issues. Catherine Sullivan shut him down. Dr. Carver's son was victimized by failures in our system. His emotional involvement is appropriate and doesn't diminish his professional judgment. If anything, it makes him more committed to protecting all students, not just those from influential families. The public comment period at that meeting was revealing. Multiple parents spoke in support of the reforms, sharing stories of their own children being bullied without consequences for the perpetrators. But several parents also spoke against the changes, arguing that we were creating a soft environment that didn't prepare kids for the real world. One mother said, "My son is being punished for normal boy behavior. He pushed a kid who was annoying him, and now he's suspended. This is ridiculous." I responded from my seat at the board table. "Your son pushed a smaller student into a locker hard enough to bruise his ribs. Multiple students witnessed it. This wasn't a momentary frustration. It was targeted violence against a vulnerable peer." She shook her head, insisting I didn't understand how boys socialized. The divide was clear. Some parents saw any accountability for their children as persecution. Others saw accountability as long overdue justice. The local media coverage of the Lincoln scandal had broader ripple effects. 3 other school districts in the region contacted me asking about our new policies, interested in implementing similar reforms. A state legislator introduced a bill requiring all districts to have independent bullying oversight, not controlled by school administrators. The bill was named Ethan's Law, though we hadn't sought that recognition. National education publications wrote articles about the case, using it as an example of how institutional cultures could protect bullies while punishing victims. I was invited to speak at conferences about school safety and administrative accountability. Some of these opportunities felt exploitative, like people wanted to hear dramatic stories rather than implement actual changes. But I accepted them anyway, hoping that sharing what happened might prevent similar failures elsewhere. 1 year after the assault, Ethan was doing better, still in therapy, still processing trauma, but functioning. He'd made friends at his new school, joined the chess club, started smiling again. Jennifer and I took him to dinner to mark the anniversary, not celebrating, but acknowledging his survival and growth. "Do you ever regret that I revealed I was the superintendent?" I asked him. It was something that had weighed on me. If I'd stayed anonymous, would the school have taken action eventually, or would Ethan have continued suffering? Ethan thought about it. "I wish you hadn't had to. I wish they'd helped me because I needed help, not because of who you were. But they didn't, so I'm glad you did what you did." That ambivalence captured the complexity perfectly. The system should have worked for every student. It didn't. Using my authority to force accountability was necessary, but also revealed how broken things were. Connor Yates completed his probation and community service. I'd heard through mutual connections that his parents had enrolled him in an expensive therapeutic boarding school, essentially exiling him while calling it treatment. I didn't know if he'd learned anything or if he'd just learned to hide his violence better. The other boys who'd participated in the assault had returned to their regular schools with minimal consequences beyond the court-ordered requirements. Some people thought I should have pushed for harsher penalties, but I'd never wanted to destroy kids' lives. I wanted them to understand that violence had consequences and to change their behavior. Thomas Yates finally resigned from the school board in March, not because of ethics violations, but because of health issues. He'd had a heart attack and decided to step back from public service. I didn't celebrate his departure, just felt relief that we'd have one less obstacle to reform. His replacement was Angela Torres, the mother whose daughter had been sexually harassed. She ran on a platform of student safety and won easily. Her first vote was to expand our bullying prevention programs and increase funding for school counselors. 2 years after the assault, the district's data showed measurable changes. Reported bullying incidents had increased 32%. That sounds bad until you understand that increased reporting meant students' trusted adults would take action. Previous underreporting had masked the scope of the problem. Substantiated incidents that resulted in intervention had increased 89%. The gap between reporting and action had dramatically shrunk. Student surveys showed increased feelings of safety at school. Parent satisfaction with bullying response had improved. These were imperfect metrics for complex issues, but they suggested real progress. Not every student was protected. Not every bully faced consequences, but more kids were getting help than before. Dr. Brennan helped me process my own trauma from watching my son suffer and feeling powerless to help him through official channels. I'd spent 3 years as superintendent, believing I was making the district better, only to discover my own son was being victimized in a system I led. That guilt was crushing. "You couldn't have known," Dr. Brennan said during one of our sessions. "You deliberately separated your professional role from Ethan's school experience. The failure wasn't yours. It was Principal Grayson's and the culture that enabled her." Intellectually, I understood that. Emotionally, I still felt like I should have seen it sooner, should have known something was wrong when Ethan started making excuses not to go to school, should have pushed harder when he'd mentioned having some problems with other kids. The warning signs had been there. I'd missed them because I was busy running a district of 14,000 students. Dr. Brennan challenged that guilt. If you'd known, you would have acted. You did act as soon as you understood the situation. That's what matters. Maybe. But I also knew that hundreds of parents had tried to act, had reported their children's victimization, and been dismissed. They hadn't had superintendent badges to force accountability. That inequality haunted me. 3 years after the assault, I was asked to speak at a national conference on school safety. The audience was mostly administrators, people running districts and schools across the country. I told Ethan's story, not sparing details about my own institution's failures. Described the moment Principal Grayson's demeanor changed when she saw my credentials, the instant transformation from dismissive to desperate. That moment revealed everything wrong with how we handle vulnerable students, I said. The abuse my son suffered didn't become real or important because I was a superintendent. It was always real. It always mattered. But the system only responded when I had power. I talked about the institutional cultures that protected certain students while sacrificing others. The way wealth, race, and social status determined whose suffering was taken seriously. The administrators who maintained those systems while claiming to serve all children equally. Some audience members looked uncomfortable, others nodded with recognition. During Q&A, a principal from Ohio stood up. "Dr. Carver, I appreciate your honesty, but aren't you being too harsh on your former principal?" She was dealing with competing pressures from influential parents and trying to maintain school culture. Sometimes administrators have to make difficult judgment calls. The question was revealing, showing how deeply the culture of protecting power was embedded. "No," I said flatly. "There's no difficult judgment call involved in protecting children from violence. When a student is being assaulted and teachers are documenting it, the only appropriate response is immediate intervention. Anything else is a failure." Another principal asked how I'd managed to implement reforms without facing massive parent pushback. "I did face massive pushback," I said. "From parents who benefited from the old system, from board members who wanted to protect the status quo, from staff who thought increased accountability meant more work. I implemented reforms anyway, because the alternative was continuing to fail vulnerable students." The keynote speaker after me was a researcher who'd studied bullying prevention programs nationally. She cited my district as an example of successful reform, but noted that sustainability was challenging. Once the spotlight moves on, once the superintendent who drove these changes leaves or gets distracted by other priorities, the old culture often reasserts itself. True change requires constant vigilance. She was right. I couldn't protect every student personally, couldn't review every incident report. The systems I'd built would only work if the people running them were committed to using them properly. That required hiring and training administrators who prioritized student safety over institutional reputation. 5 years after the assault, Ethan was 17, a senior in high school. He'd decided to write his college application essay about his experience with bullying and the activism that had followed. He asked me to review it before submitting. The essay was raw and powerful. He wrote about the isolation of being victimized while authority figures looked away, the feeling of being told his suffering didn't matter. The moment everything changed when I revealed who I was. I realized that day that justice often depends on who you know, he wrote. That scared me more than the bullying itself. Because what about all the kids whose parents aren't superintendents? Who protects them? He'd channeled his trauma into a critique of systemic inequity. I was proud of him and heartbroken that he'd learned these lessons so young. The essay concluded with his decision to study education policy in college, to work on building systems that protected all students rather than just the privileged. My father showed me that one person with authority can force change when institutions fail. But we need systems that don't require someone with power to intervene. We need schools that protect every student by default, not just when their parents have impressive credentials. He got into his first-choice university, a school with an excellent education policy program. At his high school graduation, standing in the audience watching him accept his diploma, I thought about how far we'd come. From that terrible day in Principal Grayson's office to this moment of triumph felt like traveling across a vast distance. Jennifer squeezed my hand. "He made it," she said quietly. "Despite everything, he made it." I nodded, unable to speak through the emotion. Ethan had made it. But so many other kids hadn't. The reforms I'd implemented would help some of them, would prevent some future violence. But systemic change was slow and incomplete. There were still principals like Grayson protecting bullies, still board members like Yates using their influence to shield the powerful, still students suffering while adults looked away. That reality meant the work wasn't finished, might never be finished, but it had to continue anyway. 7 years after the assault, I attended a school board meeting where Angela Torres proposed expanding mental health services for students who'd experienced bullying. The budget allocation was substantial, and several board members questioned whether it was necessary. A new board member, elected just 6 months earlier, argued that we were spending too much money on soft services instead of academic programs. "We're a school district, not a therapy clinic," he said. "These kids need to learn resilience, not run to counselors every time someone is mean to them." Angela's response was sharp. 7 years ago, a student in this district was beaten unconscious, while adults who were supposed to protect him looked away. The institutional failures that enabled that violence had lasting impacts not just on him, but on dozens of other students. We implemented reforms to prevent future failures. Those reforms cost money. Mental health services cost money. But they cost less than the lawsuits, the settlements, the destroyed lives that result from doing nothing. The new board member looked uncomfortable. "I'm not saying we shouldn't address legitimate cases of bullying. I'm saying we might be overreacting." I was sitting in the audience but stood to address the board during public comment. "I'm Richard Carver, former superintendent of this district. The student Angela referenced was my son. The reforms she's defending grew from his experience and the experiences of many other victimized students. Calling mental health services an overreaction fundamentally misunderstands the lasting damage bullying causes." I explained the years of therapy Ethan had needed, the ongoing anxiety and depression he still managed, the way trauma had shaped his development. Providing support for students who've been victimized isn't soft or excessive. It's basic decency. If you think it's too expensive, calculate the cost of not providing it. Destroyed educational outcomes, increased dropout rates, long-term mental health crisis, students who never reached their potential because they were traumatized and no one helped them heal. The board member didn't respond, but the measure passed 4-3. Watching Angela lead that fight reminded me that change required constant defenders, people who understood what was at stake and refused to let the old culture reassert itself. 10 years after the assault, Ethan graduated from college with a master's degree in education policy. His thesis examined the gap between anti-bullying policies and their implementation, using data from multiple districts, including Riverside. He'd identified the factors that predicted whether schools would actually follow their own policies: administrator turnover, board composition, community wealth demographics, and most significantly, whether previous failures had resulted in accountability. Schools that had faced consequences for inadequate bullying responses were more likely to take future complaints seriously. Schools that had gotten away with institutional failures continued those failures. It was a depressing conclusion, but an accurate one. Ethan got a job with a nonprofit that helped schools implement evidence-based bullying prevention programs. He was 22 years old, doing work that grew directly from his trauma. I was proud of him and wished he'd never had the experiences that led him to this career. On the 10th anniversary of the assault, we had dinner together, just the two of us. Ethan was visiting from Washington, D.C., where he now lived and worked. We talked about his job, his life, his ongoing therapy. "Do you regret what happened?" he asked me. Not the assault, obviously, but everything after. The public fight, the media attention, having our lives examined. I thought carefully before answering. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that showing my superintendent badge changed everything, when nothing about your injuries or your suffering had changed. I regret that we lived in a system where power determined whose pain mattered. But do I regret forcing accountability? No. I'd do it again. Ethan nodded slowly. I regret that other kids didn't have what I had, a father who could force the system to work. That's what drives me now, building systems where every kid has protection, not just the ones whose parents have credentials. That had always been the heart of it. The injustice wasn't just that Ethan had suffered. It was that countless other kids had suffered the same way or worse, and no one with authority had forced change on their behalf. My superintendent badge had saved my son. But badges shouldn't be required for children to receive basic protection from violence. Institutions should protect every student by default, not just when it was politically or socially convenient. That was the goal we were still working toward. Imperfectly, incompletely, but persistently. Because the alternative, accepting that some children matter less than others, that some students are expendable for the sake of institutional reputation, was unthinkable. Principal Eleanor Grayson had told me my son was too sensitive, that middle school boys roughhoused, that I needed to let kids work things out themselves. She'd said all of that while looking at his split lip and bruised face. Then she'd seen my superintendent badge, and everything changed. The speed of that transformation had been damning. Revealed exactly who the system was designed to protect and who it was willing to sacrifice. 10 years later, sitting with my son who'd survived and built a career from his trauma, I understood that revelation had been necessary. Painful, but necessary. Because you can't fix systems you won't acknowledge are broken. 15 years after the assault, I retired from education. Spent 3 decades working in schools, the last 20 in administration, left with pride in some of the changes I'd helped implement and frustration at how much work remained. Ethan flew in for my retirement party, gave a speech thanking me for fighting for him when the system failed. "My father taught me that justice doesn't happen by accident," he said. "It requires people willing to use whatever power they have to force institutions to fulfill their obligations." He showed me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. The speech made me uncomfortable in a good way, made me remember that one person's actions could matter, even when those actions felt inadequate against systemic failures. I thought about Principal Grayson sometimes, wondered whether she'd learned anything from being fired or whether she'd convinced herself she'd been unfairly scapegoated. Wondered if she ever thought about the students she'd failed to protect. Probably not. People rarely admitted their complicity in systems that benefited them. They rationalized, explained, minimized, convinced themselves they'd been doing their best under difficult circumstances. But I knew the truth. She'd had multiple opportunities to help my son and many other students. She'd chosen not to because helping them would have been politically inconvenient, because protecting wealthy families and star athletes mattered more to her than protecting vulnerable kids. That wasn't complicated or nuanced. It was a moral failure, pure and simple. And when I'd shown her my superintendent badge, she'd instantly recognized her error, not because she'd suddenly developed empathy, but because she'd recognized a threat to her career. 20 years after the assault, Ethan was 42. His organization had expanded to work with over 200 school districts nationwide. The evidence-based programs they implemented had measurable impacts on reducing bullying and improving students' sense of safety. He'd become a national expert, quoted in media, consulted by policymakers, speaking at conferences where I'd once spoken. We met for lunch during one of his trips through Riverside. Gray had started creeping into his hair. He had a successful career, a family, a life built on purpose and meaning. But I could still see shadows of that traumatized 12-year-old in his eyes sometimes. Trauma didn't just disappear because you'd built something good from it. "Do you ever talk to people from Lincoln?" he asked. "Teachers, students from back then?" I shook my head. No, that chapter closed when we left. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I ran into Connor Yates last year at a conference. He was representing his father's foundation. They fund youth sports programs." The coincidence was striking. "Did you talk to him?" Ethan nodded. Briefly. He didn't recognize me at first. When I told him who I was, he looked uncomfortable. Said he'd done a lot of therapy, worked on his issues, tried to be a better person. I waited, knowing there was more. He apologized. Said he was sorry for what he'd done, that he understood now how much damage he'd caused. He seemed sincere. The apology mattered less than Ethan's response to it. "How did you feel?" Ethan considered the question. "I appreciated the apology, but it doesn't undo anything. He's had 20 years to become a better person. I've had 20 years to heal from what he did. We're both different people now, but that doesn't erase what happened." That wisdom had been hard-earned. Forgiveness was complicated when the trauma had shaped your entire life trajectory. Connor's apology might have been genuine, but it couldn't return the years Ethan had spent in therapy, couldn't remove the anxiety that still flared in certain situations, couldn't restore the innocence that had been beaten out of him in a middle school bathroom. "Your work helps kids like you were," I said. "That matters more than Connor's apology." Ethan smiled, a little sad. "I know. But I still wish none of it had happened. Wish I could have just been a normal kid whose father was a superintendent, without the trauma, without the fight, without becoming a symbol for systemic failure." I understood that wish. Understood the weight of being someone whose suffering had become a case study, whose name was attached to legislation, whose story was told at conferences. Ethan had never asked for any of that. He'd just wanted to go to school without being beaten. The fact that achieving that basic goal had required me to reveal my position of power said everything about what was wrong with how we protected children. But it also showed that change was possible when people with authority chose to use it for justice rather than comfort. 25 years after the assault, I was 70 years old. Ethan was 47. We still had dinner every few months, still talked about the work of protecting students, still carried the weight of knowing how easily systems failed vulnerable people. The reforms I'd implemented at Riverside had mostly survived, though there had been backsliding during budget crises and administrative turnover. The eternal struggle between protecting children and protecting institutions continued. Some days the institutions won, but more days than before, the children won. That was progress, imperfect, incomplete, but real. And it had started with a principal dismissing my son's complaint until she saw my superintendent badge. That moment had exposed the rot at the system's core. The rest was just following the decay until we found its source and cut it out. The work of building something better in its place would continue long after I was gone. Would continue through people like Ethan who'd survived the system's failures and dedicated themselves to fixing it. That was the only real justice, not revenge against the people who'd failed us, but ensuring fewer people would be failed in the future. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.